In the early decades of the 19th century, America was still a land of vast distances, endless frontiers, and unbroken silence stretching between oceans. The Great Plains were crossed only by weary travelers on horseback, caravans of settlers, and the slow creak of wagon wheels cutting through the dust. From the smoky ports of New York to the golden promise of California, it took months, sometimes half a year, to cross the young nation. Yet beneath that stillness, something was stirring, a new rhythm that would forever change the heartbeat of America. It began with the hiss of steam, the clang of iron, and the daring dream of men who believed machines could conquer distance. The Industrial Revolution had already swept across Britain, and now its restless spirit had leapt across the Atlantic to American shores. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore hummed with the sounds of invention, as engineers and craftsmen sought to tame the power of steam. They envisioned a nation no longer divided by wilderness, but bound together by rails of iron and wheels of progress. The first American locomotives were crude and temperamental, belching smoke and sparks as they rattled uncertainly along short stretches of track. Yet even in those shaky beginnings, people sensed something extraordinary, the birth of a new era that would redraw the map of the continent. Farmers left their plows to stare at the strange beasts that moved without horses, powered only by fire and water. Children would run alongside the rails, shouting in wonder as the engines thundered past like living dragons of iron. For many, it was both thrilling and terrifying, a symbol of human triumph, but also a warning of unstoppable change. As the first rail lines connected small towns to great cities, commerce began to move faster than the rivers or the wind could ever carry it. Timber, coal, and iron surged through the arteries of the growing nation, feeding its hunger for progress and expansion. The old America of slow journeys and isolated frontiers began to fade into memory, replaced by a world that moved to the pulse of pistons and steam. Newspapers called it a miracle, preachers called it a sign of destiny, and politicians called it the future of the Republic. For the first time, Americans could imagine a day when the Atlantic and the Pacific might be joined by a single unbroken line of steel. That dream would demand courage, sacrifice, and the labor of thousands who would lay the rails mile by mile through mountains, deserts, and storms. But in those early years, before the first great transcontinental route, the nation was still learning what such power truly meant. It was not yet a story of conquest, but of beginning's a quiet dawn, before the thunder of progress would shake the land from coast to coast. As the promise of the railroad spread across the nation, it was not the dreamers in polished offices who shaped its path, but the rough hands of men who lived by the hammer and the shovel. They came from every corner of the world, Irish immigrants fleeing hunger, Chinese laborers seeking fortune, freed slaves chasing freedom, and restless Americans chasing hope beyond the horizon. For each mile of track, there were stories written not in ink, but in sweat, dust, and sometimes blood. The clang of hammers striking spikes echoed through valleys and mountains, a grim music that carried the rhythm of human endurance. Camps sprang up overnight, makeshift towns of tents and timber where laughter and hardship shared the same fire. At dawn, men rose to the call of foremen, their faces lined with fatigue, their backs already aching before the first swing of the day. Meals were simple bread, beans, and black coffee, but they fueled bodies driven by the belief that they were building more than a railroad. They were building a bridge between the known and the unknown, between the settled East and the wild, untamed West. In the evenings, when the tools fell silent, the men gathered around fires to tell stories of home, of sweethearts left behind, and of a future they hoped would find them when the tracks were done. The engineers, though more educated, shared in the same dangers one misjudged curve or weak bridge could turn a day's triumph into a tragedy of twisted metal. Storms tore through camps, floods washed away progress, and yet each setback only seemed to strengthen their resolve. Among them were men like John Sullivan, an Irish foreman known for his temper and his heart, who would not leave a sick worker behind, even when time and money screamed otherwise. There was Lee Chen, a quiet man from Canton, who could lay track faster than anyone in his crew, his movements steady as the ticking of a clock. And there were countless others whose names were never written down, but whose calloused hands left marks deeper than any monument. The railroad was not built by machines alone, it was built by human spirit, by men who refused to surrender to mountains or fate. Some died under collapsing bridges, some vanished into snowstorms, and some simply walked away, swallowed by the endless wilderness they helped to open. But for every loss, there was a victory, the first whistle echoing across a new valley. A town sprung to life at the sound of approaching wheels. Letters home carried words of exhaustion and pride, the sense that they were part of something far greater than themselves. To them, the Iron Road was not just progress. It was proof that their struggle mattered, that their names, though unspoken, would ride the rails long after they were gone. As miles of track stretched westward, America itself began to change, shaped not only by invention, but by the unyielding will of those who built it. And though history would remember the presidents and tycoons, the true soul of the railroad would always belong to the workers who laid its bones across the wilderness. It was the morning of May 10th, 1869, when the final spike was driven into the earth at Promontory Summit, Utah, and the nation held its breath. Around the gathered workers, engineers, soldiers, and curious townsfolk, the desert wind carried the faint sound of celebration, distant bells ringing from San Francisco to New York. The two great rail lines, one from the east and one from the west, had finally met nose to nose, like iron stallions shaking hands across the continent. With that single clang of the golden spike, a dream older than a generation became reality, binding together oceans, families, and fortunes. Men who had once swung hammers in blizzards now stood in silence, their faces cracked by sun and years, realizing they had built not just a railroad, but a legacy. Telegraph wires carried the news instantly across the land. "Done," the message read, and for the first time, the entire country cheered in the same heartbeat. The whistle of the first Transcontinental train echoed like a hymn of triumph, rising from the valleys and carried by the wind over prairies and peaks. America had found its spine, a steel backbone stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, pulsing with the promise of unity and progress. Towns that once seemed lost to the wilderness suddenly bloomed beside the rails, their streets alive with merchants, travelers, and the scent of coal smoke. For settlers, the West was no longer a distant myth, but a destination just days away. For traders, the nation had become one vast marketplace, Yet, for all its glory, the iron road carried both light and shadow, as prosperity for some came at the cost of others' land and peace. Native tribes watched in sorrow as the tracks cut through their sacred grounds, bringing strangers and soldiers, forever changing the rhythm of their world. The railroad had conquered distance, but it also marked the beginning of a new struggle between progress and preservation, between speed and silence. Still, in the hearts of those who lived to see it, there was awe, a sense that mankind had wrestled with nature and, for better or worse, had won. The engineers returned to their cities, the laborers drifted to new jobs, and the fires of the camps burned out one by one beneath the western sky. In their place rose depots, telegraph poles, and bustling towns where laughter and commerce replaced the old songs of hammers and steam. Trains became the lifeblood of a growing empire, carrying not only goods and passengers, but also stories, dreams, and the pulse of a restless nation. The whistle that once signaled the dawn of progress soon became the familiar heartbeat of America itself, a sound both comforting and eternal. And though time would dull the shine of the golden spike, its echo still lingers in every track that hums beneath the passing wheels. The railroad did more than connect cities. It connected destinies, binding a divided people into one shared horizon. And so, the story of the first train through America was not merely about steel and steam, but about the courage, toil, and hope that carried a young nation forward into its future.